Picture yourself walking into Manchester's one and only public bathroom. The stench is unbearable, and the filth on the floor is just the beginning. Here, one tiny mistake could cost you your life. By the late 19th century, a simple trip to the bathroom in an industrialized city like Manchester could be a death sentence. Death was a constant presence, and the threat of disease spread like wildfire through a broken, collapsing sanitation system. Contaminated water, human waste in the streets, the looming threat of cholera and typhoid fever, all of it was just normal life. The choice wasn't between a clean bathroom and a dirty one, but between risking illness or having no way to avoid the most basic human need. There was no real option, and the outcome sat beyond the control of millions. The scariest part, this isn't fiction. It happened, and for far longer than we'd like to believe. The year is 1880. The Industrial Revolution reshaped the world, but it also left a trail of misery and disease in its wake. The progress flooding into cities brought a new pace of life, faster, more modern, and also more dangerous. Big cities were booming, with zero planning for what happens when populations explode. Amid all the shiny new technology and industry, one crucial issue kept getting shoved aside: public health, while new factories, railways, and markets popped up on every corner. The streets of European and American cities became a stew of mud, sewage, and garbage. Sewer systems were usually non-existent, or so useless they may as well not have been there. Cities were poorly designed, and the idea of basic sanitation was basically a fantasy, a luxury the rich could afford and everyone else could only dream about. The air was soaked with smoke, rivers were poisoned with waste, and drinking water, when you could get it, was a precious resource that still couldn't always be trusted. In city centers, things were even worse. As population surged, infrastructure didn't just crack, it collapsed. Homes didn't have private toilets, and when latrines existed at all, they were thrown together cheaply and badly. In many cities, the common practice was to dump human waste straight into the streets, where residents had no choice but to walk through it, literally stepping in what many treated like harmless trash, when in reality it was a boiling soup of lethal disease. Out in the countryside, the lack of hygiene also meant crude, bare-bones waste systems. Poverty and ignorance made life even grimmer, with constant exposure to human waste as part of daily existence. Bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, and other diseases spread through air and water weren't just common. They were endemic, tearing through communities again and again. And yet, many people still didn't realize these illnesses were tied directly to the lack of proper sanitation. Medical science was still crawling, and in theory, the idea that invisible microbes caused epidemics was new and widely dismissed. For most people, disease felt random and uncontrollable, a punishment from God, or just bad luck. Meanwhile, cities kept growing, factory chimneys pumping black smoke into the sky, streets flooding with feces and urine, and daily life turning into a constant fight against an invisible enemy. That chaos and neglect created a spiral of suffering and death. Epidemics spread fast, killing thousands in a matter of weeks, with no real prevention and no effective treatment. Fear was everywhere, but worst of all was the helplessness. Death didn't come only from cholera or typhoid fever. It lived on every corner, in the nauseating smells, the infected water, and the everyday routines of a society that had learned to live with tragedy. And the most terrifying part of all, for many people, something as ordinary as using the bathroom, natural, boring, human, could be the last thing they ever did. At the heart of this sanitation disaster was one big problem. Cities had no infrastructure for the chaos they created. Uncontrolled growth packed people together, but streets were badly designed, with no drainage and no proper sewer systems. Sewage was crude and often dumped directly into streets or rivers, poisoning the same water people drank. Latrines were improvised, exposed setups that spread feces and urine through neighborhoods. For most people, a safe and hygienic toilet wasn't a basic right. It was a far-off luxury. In poor districts, conditions were even more brutal. In wealthy neighborhoods, private bathrooms existed, but they were often more status symbol than real protection, since sewer systems were still inefficient. Poverty and lack of education made any reform, or even basic care, impossible for the working classes. Every day, people lived with the choking stink of filth and the constant threat of diseases like cholera and typhoid. The sewer system, flawed from the start of the Industrial Revolution, never kept up with city growth. For most, that lack of sanitation wasn't just inconvenient, it was survival mode, in a world where dying from preventable disease was basically routine. As sanitation conditions kept deteriorating, the impact on public health became impossible to ignore. What looked like a simple infrastructure problem turned into a chain reaction with disaster-level consequences. The lack of proper sewage, polluted water, and abandoned hygiene practices weren't isolated failures. They were connected, feeding each other and creating a vicious cycle of misery and death. Water, the thing that's supposed to keep you alive, became a delivery service for death. Rivers that once supplied cities were now contaminated with human waste, garbage, and industrial runoff. With no effective sewer system, feces and urine from public and private latrines ended up mixing into the same water people drank. For many families, the only clean water source was also the city's unofficial sewage highway. So disease spread through something as basic as drinking a glass of water or boiling soup. The damage was brutal. Cholera and typhoid fever spread fast and killed faster. Cholera, for instance, traveled through water contaminated by the feces of infected people. In 1831, a cholera epidemic tore through Europe, and it would come back again and again over the following decades, often deadlier each time. Families trapped in overcrowded neighborhoods watched children, friends, and relatives fall sick within days. There were no public health systems, no coordinated response, nothing resembling an organized defense. Death was quick, vicious, and basically unavoidable. And while all that was happening, the streets stayed filthy. Waste wasn't just in latrines. It was smeared across roads, sidewalks, and any open space that could handle it, meaning all of them. The lack of cleaning was glaring, and municipal authorities, when they existed at all, had limited resources and zero readiness to face a crisis. This massive cities weren't becoming hubs of progress and innovation. They were becoming contamination machines, where breathing, touching, or eating could be enough to get infected. Inside homes, things weren't much better. Family life was shaped by constant exposure to the risks of poor hygiene. In a world where personal hygiene practices were barely known, disease spread easily. Most families didn't have access to soap, clean clothes, or proper ways to disinfect anything. And without education on why hygiene mattered, people were sitting ducks for infections that today would be easily prevented. The constant reek of feces and urine seeped into everything, turning daily life into a mix of desperation and helplessness. Disease didn't care about social class, but poverty made the suffering nastier and more relentless. The wealthy could retreat into mansions with private bathrooms and access to doctors. The poor were trapped in overcrowded tenements, where survival was a daily grind. And the cruelest part, even in the most modest homes, families were exposed to dangers they couldn't control. Eating, drinking, or stepping outside for work could be a death sentence, delivered by diseases that showed absolutely no mercy. Epidemics weren't random, one-off tragedies. They were part of the non-stop loop of suffering that defined life in big industrial cities. Across the industrialized world, people had to live with the reality that everyday actions, drinking water, hossing a toilet, could quietly lock in a tragic ending. It was survival in a world that seemed designed to offer none. While cities and rural areas were being wrecked by the lack of basic sanitation and the spread of disease, the human cost became clearer by the day. For millions of people, every single day was a fight to stay alive, with the odds of getting caught in an epidemic always hanging overhead. Simply leaving in 1880 meant living in a permanent state of danger. For the working class, the suffering hit even harder. Men and women who spent endless hours in factories under brutal conditions had to deal with disease with little to no medical help. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and treatments were ineffective, often based on half-medieval practices. Medicine was still a long way from what we know today, and cholera, typhus, yellow fever, and other illnesses spread without mercy. Children were especially vulnerable. In the poorest areas, infant mortality was sky-high, and dying from bacterial or viral disease wasn't bad luck. It was basically the daily forecast. Mothers watched their children, sometimes still babies, collapse from diarrhea and dehydration in a matter of days. There was no cure, no relief, and the cruelty was sharpened by the fact that many of these deaths could have been prevented with basic hygiene measures, like purifying water and properly treating human waste. But for the poor, those solutions were out of reach. What remained was a short, uncertain life, where people died in huge numbers and everyone just endured it because they had no other choice. The fear of death wasn't some abstract idea. It was physical. You could smell it in the streets. Dirty, infected roads made it real. Kids playing on sidewalks were exposed constantly. Disease moved with terrifying speed, and authorities, mostly absent or helpless, did nothing to stop it. When an epidemic hit, cities froze. Commerce stalled. Schools shut down. Families barricaded themselves inside, waiting for the worst. But suffering wasn't limited to the extremely poor. Factory and market workers faced the same dangers, with one key difference. The rich and powerful were insulated from the worst conditions. They lived in cleaner, more isolated areas and had access to medical care. They could hire private doctors, buy safer food, and live far from the foul reality of overcrowded streets. The divide between rich and poor wasn't just about comfort. It was about who got to live. For most people, dying early was a constant possibility. For the elite, the world played by different rules. Factory work itself came with a devastating price. Workers spent their days inhaling dust, smoke, and industrial grime, making them more likely to develop respiratory diseases and other debilitating conditions. Factory life was brutal, and many workers got sick fast and died young, long before they ever got to see any change in their lives. Meanwhile, the city, supposedly the symbol of progress, turned into a battlefield, where life and death were so close together people could barely tell them apart anymore. Epidemics swallowing entire neighborhoods became routine. The helplessness was crushing. Suffering was constant, and hope was in short supply. Living in that world was like being trapped under the thumb of a cruel, inevitable fate. Living in 1880 meant being under constant threat. In the big cities, the streets were disgusting trash and human waste everywhere, ruled by a rotten stench and thick pollution. People walked barefoot, breathing poisoned air, with zero protection against disease. Inside poor homes, filth was everywhere. Many families used makeshift latrines behind the house, with no ventilation and no hygiene. Stifling heat and the smell of urine and food blended into the exhaustion of workers who never truly got to rest. Clean drinking water was a rare luxury, and even when you could get it, it was often contaminated. Most people drank from dirty sources, mixed with human waste and pollutants. The risk of disease never let up, because clean water was simply out of reach for the poorest. Inside the homes, respiratory illnesses spread easily, made worse by factory smoke and piles of uncollected garbage. Families often packed into cramped tenements, slept on bug-infested beds, while children played in filth, basically playing tag with death. In the countryside, it wasn't much better. Rural life could be calmer in some ways, but the lack of medical care and sanitation meant diseases like cholera and typhus were common among peasant families. Latrines were often placed near water sources, creating a direct pipeline between human waste and what should have been the most vital resource of all, water. For many families, harvests were meager, and disease piled an extra punishment on people who were already living on the edge. Factory work left deep scars on body and mind. Workers were forced to spend long hours in dirty environments, breathing chimney smoke and handling dangerous chemicals with no protection. The workload was brutal. Accidents were frequent, and every day felt like another stress test for the human body. People dragged themselves home exhausted and sick, just to face the same nightmare again the next day. But physical suffering wasn't the only thing crushing them. The constant fear of getting sick or losing someone you loved seeped into everything. For most families, illness wasn't a surprise. It was expected. Cholera, typhoid fever, and other infectious diseases hit fast, and death showed up without knocking. There weren't enough hospitals or qualified doctors to meet demand, and the few treatments available were ineffective or sometimes made things worse. In a world that bleak, there wasn't much room for comfort or hope. Fear of death lived on every corner, in every filthy latrine, every puddle of contaminated water. People couldn't afford to be picky. Survival was a daily fight, and simply making it to the end of the day was an achievement. In that context, living meant constantly adapting to suffering, disease, and death creeping closer, a massive effort just to resist the inevitable. Even though misery and death haunted city streets, there was a parallel reality, a cruel gap of contrasts separating the rich from the poor. While workers and struggling families faced the invisible plague of disease and the constant stench of filthy streets, the upper class lived in a different world, still threatened by epidemics, yes, but with the tools to protect themselves. Luxury, privilege, and sheer distance from everyday life created a deep divide between these two worlds, and inequality became even more obvious as most people's suffering intensified. In wealthy neighborhoods, residents had private bathrooms and hygienic conditions that shielded them from disease, while most people lived exposed to constant danger. Their homes were well ventilated and often equipped with drainage and sewage systems that, while nothing like today's, still reduced risks the poor faced every single day. The contrast in living conditions between the upper class and the poorest was outrageous. Rich families could pay for private doctors, access safer food, and drink purified water. Meanwhile, the massive working population was stuck with whatever scraps remained of an improvised sewage system, contaminated water, and hygiene conditions that authorities basically ignored. Work in factories, markets, and construction made laborers even more vulnerable. Because they weren't only exposed to unhealthy workplaces, they also had to go home to cities with atrocious sanitary conditions. The gap was so huge that the rich could even afford to isolate themselves from epidemic threats. Their mansions sat far from working-class districts and zones of misery, often located in cleaner areas away from pollution and disease. They didn't have to fear contact with filthy water or disease-soaked streets, because their money and social status kept them separate from those dangers. They could soak in copper or marble bathtubs, while the poor did whatever they could to stay clean, often without enough water, and certainly not safe water. In poorer homes, the reality was completely different. Families were crammed into tiny rooms, where space and privacy were distant fantasies. Constant contact with garbage, feces, and urine in the streets and in makeshift latrines fueled the spread of disease. For these families, public toilets were a constant risk, a place with no privacy and almost no chance of hygiene. Children, who spent much of their time outside, faced terrifyingly high death rates because of exposure to these unhealthy conditions. And on top of that, everyone shared the fear of epidemics, but the response wasn't even close to equal. For the rich, disease could often be avoided with hygiene practices and a healthcare system that catered to them. For the poor, disease was almost destiny. The lower classes didn't have access to healthcare, and when they got sick, their chances of survival were slim. They couldn't pay for treatment or even basic medicine. That class divide showed up in living conditions. The rich could hide in comfortable homes while the poor wrestled with death out in the streets. For the lower classes, suffering was daily, not only because of disease, but because of scarcity, extreme poverty, and the total absence of support. And as if that weren't enough, sanitation reforms and medical advances rarely reached the people who needed them most, as if the whole system were built to protect the rich and neglect everyone else. In the farther out neighborhoods, where epidemics spread more easily, conditions were truly inhumane. Everything was missing: clean water, adequate food, health care. Death was constant, and the rich, even when they could see suffering nearby, were too far removed to actually feel its weight. They could pay to stay safe, while the poor didn't even get the illusion of choice. The start of the 20th century brought a drastic, though gradual shift in sanitary conditions across major cities. After decades of neglect, the rising waves of epidemics and the population's widespread suffering forced authorities to finally move. Progress in medical science, combined with a growing social movement demanding better living conditions for the working class, triggered a series of reforms that began to change the city's devastating reality. One of the earliest turning points was the rise of scientific theories that explained the causes of disease, especially germ theory, championed by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. These discoveries permanently changed how illness was understood and treated. The idea that invisible microorganisms caused epidemics, like cholera and typhus, created a new urgency. Water and environments had to be cleaned and purified. But those ideas took time to spread, and by the time they fully caught on, epidemics had already killed thousands. Sanitary reforms began to ripple through major cities. London became a pioneer by implementing sewage systems after the 1854 cholera outbreak. The discovery that cholera was transmitted through contaminated water reshaped how cities approached sanitation. London's sewer system was revolutionary for its time, even if it took years for other places to follow suit. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, other cities like New York and Paris also began building their own sewer networks. Urbanization, once practically synonymous with misery and death, slowly started to be seen as a chance for modernization and progress. Sewers and potable water pipelines cleaned up large parts of cities, though progress was anything but evenly distributed. While wealthier areas enjoyed clean water and proper sanitation, poorer districts often remained stuck without access to these basic services. At the same time, public health laws began to emerge, aiming to keep cities cleaner and protect people from the spread of disease. In Mani Plus's building public toilets connected to sewer systems was encouraged, even if only in limited ways. Public health started to be understood more broadly, not just as treating illness, but preventing it by controlling the conditions that helped it spread. Poor hygiene, polluted water, and neglected waste. Improved living conditions also opened new doors for the working class. As sanitation reforms expanded, policies appeared to improve housing, including the construction of healthier tenements and the gradual elimination of open-air latrines. Workers who had been trapped in unhealthy neighborhoods could finally glimpse the possibility of living with more dignity, even though the gap between social classes was still enormous. Still, none of this happened overnight. Sanitation reforms moved slowly, and many residents in poorer areas endured unhealthy conditions for decades. Building effective sanitation across entire cities took time, and progress was uneven. In smaller towns and rural areas, sanitation problems often persisted, and epidemics continued claiming lives. Even so, the impact of these reforms was massive. Mortality rates began to drop sharply. Cholera, typhoid fever, and other infectious diseases became more controllable, and life expectancy slowly increased. The road to modern public health was long, but the change was real. Scientific advances and sanitation reforms started turning cities into safer places to live, shrinking the constant threat that had hovered over people's lives. Today, we use bathrooms without a second thought. But in the 19th century, using one could be a life-or-death gamble. Something that basic was a constant risk. Lack of hygiene, lack of sanitation, and ignorance about what caused disease turned everyday life into a silent battle against an invisible threat, often a fatal one. It's hard to wrap your mind around the fact that just a few generations ago, what we call comfort was, for millions, a very real threat to survival. Scientific progress, sanitation reforms, and the fight for dignity changed the course of history, but the cost was brutal. Millions died before the world accepted a simple truth. There's no such thing as civilization when water is dirty and sewage runs in the open. Looking back, you realize how human life has always hung on small things. Clean water, a safe toilet, a simple gesture like washing your hands. Rights that feel guaranteed today were, for centuries, victories ripped out of suffering, built on epidemics. Misery and entire cities turned into biological traps. But maybe the most unsettling part is realizing the story didn't end. Because even now, in the 21st century, there are places where using a bathroom is still dangerous, where children grow up surrounded by sewage, where old diseases still kill, where basic hygiene is still a privilege instead of a right. In many parts of the world, the distance between today and 1880 isn't as big as we'd like to believe. The history of sanitation isn't just a dark memory, it's a mirror. A warning that progress doesn't arrive for everyone at the same time, and that the simplest parts of life are still, for many people, a matter of survival. So the next time you flush a toilet, step into a clean bathroom, wash your hands without fear. Remember, that isn't normal. It's a hard-won historical achievement, and it's also a responsibility. If this story hits you hard and you want to keep digging into the brutal truths that shape the world we live in, subscribe to the channel now. Here, the past isn't distant. It's still breathing behind what we call normal life. And while that thought lingers, the next video is already on your screen. Click now and keep walking through the shadows of history.